Hello watch enthusiasts! Now as we draw towards the end of the year and towards SIHH next year, there have been quite a few releases over the past month, which have shown very interesting new directions for several brands, but also with pieces coming out really at both ends of the spectrum, both at the ultra expensive and ultra exclusive end, but also in a far more affordable category, and with some releases from brands such as Tudor, which show a new direction. Now the first piece I'd like to speak about is rather an interesting one from Archimede. And this is a brand which is known to a great extent for its bronze Flieger watches, which have become quite popular. But I feel with this piece, which is the Outdoor 41 Antimag, they have a very interesting field watch which incorporates something of a scientific timepiece with something far more wearable on a daily basis thanks to reasonable sizing, but also very impressive specifications for its €980 price. Now in terms of dimensions, the watch comes at 41mm in diameter, 46.5 from lug to lug, and only 11mm thick, which I think is a very reasonable size for a 200-metre water-resistant timepiece, with some very interesting technology in terms of anti-magnetism, but also in terms of the material the case has been made out of. Aside from its dimensions, the case is also very well conceived from an ergonomic perspective, because one has this cut-off style of tournois shape, where the lugs are hooded and the crown is guarded, thus giving this watch a sort of a somewhat compact profile for a watch of this size, whilst also having a guarded crown, which is a screw-down crown as well, giving 200 metres of water resistance. However, the material of the case is interesting because they've chosen steel from Ickler, and Ickler have owned Archimede since their creation as a brand, and this is a German company which makes steel. And so they've used a very particular type of steel with this piece that gives a 1200 Vickers hardness, which is several times harder than normal stainless steel, thus making it much more scratch resistant. In addition to this, it has an anti-reflective sapphire crystal on the front, but doesn't feature an exhibition caseback because of some of the other technology incorporated into this piece. The display of this watch is, I think, very well conceived, because one has a matte black dial with a black rehort and chapter ring rising up out of its edges, showing that second or minute track. But the central dial itself is highly legible with indices, as well as having numerals in the form of these Arabic numerals, which resemble the numerals on certain military dial versions of the AP Royal Oak. However, as a whole, the dial is very individual in terms of its design, also having minimal text, simply saying Archimede, outdoor, water-resistant 200 metres, and anti-magnetic. One does also have the date in contrasting white at 3 o'clock, and a blue second hand to accentuate the design, and of course the dial is highly legible in the dark thanks to Lume. Now where the choice of movement is concerned, one finds the Sellita SW200-1 with a 38-hour power reserve running at 4 Hz and with 26 joules. And whilst this is a simple but very reliable Swiss movement for this watch, it's the way they've protected it from magnetism which is interesting and pretty much unheard of for this price. Because they've used the classic form of a soft iron core to protect the watch, and one sees this in the layering of the case, so one has a ring running around the edge of the case on the inside to protect the movement from magnetism, whilst the front of the movement is also protected, in addition to a plate within the case bag. And so this means the watch is resistant to 1000 Gauss, which is the same as a Rolex mil Gauss. I think is very impressive for this sub €1,000 price range, considering that there really aren't other brands producing this sort of watch at this sort of price. And so I think this shows a very interesting new direction for the brand, whilst also showing an interesting competitor to existing technical watches on the market. Now the next piece I'd like to speak about is an important new direction for Tudor, with their new Glamour double date. And the Glamour line, rather unfortunately named I think, has been in the Tudor lineup for quite a while now, and in many ways replaced the concept of the Tudor Oyster Prince, being the sort of Tudor remake, if you will, of the Rolex Oyster Perpetual essentially. And this piece takes a very different direction in terms of design to anything in the Rolex lineup, and I think continues with the idea that Tudor is a very separate brand. But the piece comes in stainless steel or in two-tone yellow gold and steel, with a variation in bezel types, in addition to certain versions with diamonds on the dial. But in terms of sizing, this piece comes in at an abnormally large 42mm. But before I speak personally about how I view this watch, I'd like to speak about it from a more technical and specification sort of standpoint. So with that 42mm stainless steel case, or indeed two-tone case, you get 100 metre water resistance in spite of having an exhibition case bag. And the crucial element with this watch is it's the first model in the Glamour line to feature an in-house movement, as has been the case in the Pelagos and Black Bay lines for a while now, and so I think this is a well-needed update to the line. And so as such it features the caliber MT5641, which is an evolution of what we've seen from Tudor so far in their lineup of in-house movements, which features the standard 70-hour power reserve they use, in addition to having a COSC certification, and of course has the variable inertia screwed balance, which means a more stable timekeeping once it's been set to COSC certification, and of course a silicone balance spring to again help with accuracy. And whilst the movement is undecorated, they have added several functions to it. So now it's able to show the small seconds at 6 o'clock on the dial, in addition to a double date, with this concept of having a large date with 2 apertures with 2 separate rotating wheels. And where the case design is concerned, one has this rather soft form to the case with wide lugs and this double domed style of bezel, in addition to a sapphire crystal on the front. There's also a small crown on the one side of the case and some brushed elements on the bracelet if you choose to go with that option. And where the dial's concerned, one has a rather conservative but quite classically correct style with these vertical lines going up the centre of the dial and then a different style of patterning around the edge, whilst one has a style of concentric ring on the subdial for the seconds, which I think helps to break it down a bit, and also helps to work it into the dial itself and lower its level, which I think helps to give a great deal of layering. And the dial does come in a variety of versions in terms of colours, with black and silver being the most conservative, and then with an opaline style of dial in addition to a champagne-coloured version, depending upon what you want out of the watch. But with all of the versions, there is the option of having diamonds inset into the indices, and whilst I personally don't particularly like this option, it is something there to consider. And with prices starting at £2,300, I think it is very reasonably priced for an attractive all-purpose sort of dress watch, with the additional help and assistance of a high water resistance to be used whenever you happen to use this watch really outside the boardroom. But it's really with the design of this watch and the concept of it that I feel that Tudor have fallen short, because I simply find the design of this watch is far below the classical elegance one would expect from Tudor, but also from the Rolex group in general. And as such, the design looks like a hodgepodge of different elements, with the case at 42mm being far too large for a usable dress watch if you want to wear it formally. And whilst I don't tend to worry much about wearing a large watch for certain occasions, I feel that if you want to use this watch every day, the 42mm size is just a little bit too large, and I think it's a shame that Tudor went for this, especially when they're able to make the Black Bay, with its 200m water resistance, even smaller. And considering this one does also have an exhibition caseback, which doesn't show any view of a decorated movement, when from other brands one's able to see very well and very appealingly decorated movements for half the price. I feel this is a missed opportunity. And whilst I think it is a shame that Tudor haven't put more attention to this watch in terms of its design and its general aesthetic, I do appreciate the importance of this watch as a sort of a second chance, really, for Tudor's dress watches to really shine after changing and moving away from simply producing ETA movement Rolex pieces in the past. And so I think this piece, whilst not perfect at the moment, may yield really interesting results in coming years. Now, the third piece I'd like to speak about is an interesting new model from Ulysse Nardin. And this is a model which comes in at 42mm and thus makes up the smallest model in their diver line, with previous models coming in at 44mm or above. And so this is an interesting direction for the brand because it offers something which is far more mainstream in terms of people being able to enjoy it and appreciate it in a more wearable sort of size than larger models. And this piece comes in stainless steel, and whilst the pricing of this watch is very much in line with the rest of Ulysse Nardin's range, it does offer an interesting option with perhaps a more accessible movement choice, but still with a great deal of the technology where the finishing of the case is concerned, and also where the general detailing of this brand is demonstrated. And it's the detailing with this piece which is really important, because aside from the 42mm size, this piece is conceived with detail which really is wonderful to see at this price range. One sees brushing and polishing along the edges of this watch, with elements of detail on the sides of the case, on the crown, but especially on the dial, where one has this matted sort of surface whether you go for the blue or the black dial version. It then has Ulysse Nardin printed on the dial with the applied logo in that anchor shape, which really adds to the detailing on this dial and is impeccably executed. Then one has the indices which are also applied and have these wonderful bevels and cuts, whilst their general design and finishing is both unique on the market, but also unmistakably Ulysse Nardin in design. The date is then placed at 6 o'clock and is detailed to match the rest of the dial in the matching colour, in addition to having a stepped edge. Then one also has coloration which is very interesting throughout the dial, thanks to the use of aged luminova on the indices, and also the same coloration for the logos and the writing. However, this doesn't match the lume on the hands, but instead matches the general colour of the second hand, which I think is a nice play on the concept of aged lume, whilst giving a vintage feel to the watch and softening the look, but also not losing any of the crisp modernity. In addition to that, the case has several layers of bevelling along its edges, with bevels both in brushed forms and also in polished forms, to really help build up the case shape. This is added to the bezel form, which is very interesting with these large cog-like teeth, in addition to an insert which is cut out and ridged in different areas and different ways to give real layering and detail which you just wouldn't expect to see. This is matched with a domed sapphire crystal. And in terms of the movement inside this watch, encased within that 300-metre water-resistant form, one has a movement which is the UN 816, which is based on the Sleater SW300, but still gives a 42-hour power reserve, runs at 4 Hz, and also uses silicon parts in order to be able to give it a more high-end functionality. A rather amusing detail about this watch is the inclusion of those coordinates on the dial, and this replaces any sort of other text, and instead of having the water resistance rating, for example, or any information about the movement, these give the directions, or at least the coordinates, of the facilities where these watches are made, which I think is a rather interesting touch. And there is also, alongside the blue and black versions which come in non-limited editions, a version which is a limited edition, which comes in a blue PVD form, and is described as the Blue Shark, with orange details on the dial, and also on the general build of the watch, which I think is an interesting alternative, though my favourite amongst these are the standard versions. And the price for this piece comes in at a relatively high price for a movement which is essentially originally a Sleater movement. However, I do feel the design of the watch and the build certainly makes up for this, and the price for this watch is €5,800 to €6,800 for the limited edition. Now, to understand this next piece, one has to understand the involvement between the freediver Guillaume Nery and Panerai. And they've had a fairly long association now in terms of various pieces being seen on this freediver's wrist, who is in fact the world champion freediver if one considers his unofficial record of 139 metres, which came about when he tried to beat the 128-metre record, and there was a miscalibration or a mistake, which meant he ended up diving 10 metres further. But this particular piece they're releasing is the reference PAM 982, and it's an interesting alternative to their existing chronographs in the Luminor Submersible line. And this watch is very much at the extreme of Panerai Submersible divers, because it features really all the bells and whistles. It has a 47mm titanium case, which is certainly a very large size, but not unwearable, thanks to the fact that it is such lightweight in its titanium form. And this does mean it has a darker, more matted sort of colour than steel, which I think works very well for the concept of freediving. And so the piece itself is very much on the large end of Panerai's spectrum, and in many ways is a contrast to the normal Submersible, because one does see much smaller versions. However, the elements of the Submersible are still there, with that Luminor-style crown guard, where it has a lever to release the crown, and thus is an alternative to the concept of a screw-down crown. And then one has the chronograph pushers on the left-hand side of the case, in a somewhat abnormal orientation, but still very much accessible as a result of the watch having a somewhat flattened side, thanks to that cushion form. And despite the additional holes drilled into the case, it still retains a 300-metre water resistance. And whilst for a watch of this size one might expect a higher water resistance, bearing in mind the fact this watch is designed for the concept of freediving, I don't really think it's particularly necessary. But then in terms of external features, one also has this rather attractive matte blue ceramic bezel, which, thanks to the standard that Panerai set with their Egiziano in the 1960s, one has this very interesting design with these protruding markers in polished metal, with 15, 30 and 45 marked out, and a luminous pip at 12 o'clock. And aside from the bespoke colour of the bezel, one also has a dial which is this matted grey colour, which I think is a very interesting choice because it has this pitted surface like the bottom of the sea one might expect. It also has applied indices in the standard form, and also has luminous hands. And notably the luminous markings on the dial and the hands, and also the pip on the bezel, are different colours in order to allow it to be more legible at a glance. Then where the functions of the dial are concerned, one sees the hours and the minutes in the centre of the dial, in addition to the running seconds on the left subdial. Then on the right subdial one has the 12 hours of the chronograph, and centrally mounted one has in blue the seconds of the chronograph, and then in simple polished metal one has the minutes. And this gives a very interesting display, because it means that at a glance this is much more legible than having a subdial for the minutes, and so one is able to have a full hour readout, in addition to the hours on that subdial. And so with its formidable size, but also very interesting detailing, I think this is a very attractive alternative to the standard, very vintage line that most Panerais take. But importantly with this piece, it has a movement which shows a real evolution for the brand, and is very much a movement you would expect to see in a modern line of luxury Panerai. Because the movement inside this watch is the P9100, and this is an entirely in-house automatic chronograph movement by Panerai. And aside from giving that very interesting display with the double display of the chronograph on that central axis of the dial, one has 37 joules, a glycodur balance, it runs at 4 Hz, and uses Incablock shock protection in addition to having 2 spring barrels. But it's an interesting departure from using mostly unitas movements for Panerai, and I think is very suited to this sort of design because it means you can have this perfectly symmetrical dial, and a very interesting talking piece as well, to have a unique movement. Perhaps most interestingly though, this piece has a very interesting case back, with Guillaume Nery's signature on it, in addition to a stylised depiction of that 126-metre record, with the surface of the sea portrayed, as well as a small shoal of fish, and of course a freediver passing a rope on the way down into the abyss. And I think as a general unit, this watch is a very interesting and rather attractive option, especially for those who are freediving aficionados. And I make no secret of the fact that I have a real appreciation for Panerai, and whilst I feel that they do make their mistakes, such as the Luminor Doué, with their low water resistance, I think they're a really interesting brand from the perspective of their design and the concepts they produce. However, I can't help but feel the price for this watch is eye-wateringly high for a titanium diving chronograph, considering alternative options on the market. Even if one looks to brands such as Blancpain, one is looking at a watch half the price, since this watch comes in at €18,900. Now, the final piece I'd like to speak about is something so beyond the realms of normality that it's almost laughable. But even so, I think this piece deserves a place on this list as a pre-SIHH release, and it's the Vacheron Constantin Les Cabinotiers Grande Complication Phoenix. And it's quite an interesting piece on the basis that it really does use all the technology that Vacheron Constantin have to create a really masterful demonstration of their skill. And whilst this piece is perhaps not tasteful, it's quite an incredible demonstration of watchmaking and of skill in every realm of the creation of this piece. Now, Les Cabinotiers models are very much the pinnacle of Vacheron Constantin's production, and as such do stand certainly aside from their standard models. And this piece is no exception, with a fully engraved case, and of course a movement which is to match. And speaking about the general specifications of this watch, it has a 47mm gold case, and that's an 18-carat pink gold case, in addition to a 19.1mm thickness, and so this watch really is immense to house the movement that it has. And with this sort of watch, which is incidentally a unique piece and so will only be produced in one example, one does have to look at the complications this watch has, and really look at the movement first of all. Because the movement it has is the caliber 2755, and this is one of the very, very high-end, extremely complicated models from Vacheron Constantin. And in addition to having 40 joules and a 58-hour power reserve, whilst running at 18,000 vibrations per hour, its set of complications is simply remarkable. So in addition to the hours and the minutes on the centre of the dial, one has a tourbillon which is, as you can see, visible in the centre of the dial, which shows you the seconds. In addition to that, one has a perpetual calendar, the age and phase of the moon, in addition to the sunrise and sunset, plus a star chart, the zodiac, the sidereal time, the seasons, the solstices, and a minute repeater with a power reserve indicator as well. And so with this extensive list of features, it's really unsurprising that this watch has taken on an extremely busy form, with its gold hands displaying the various functions on the dial. And especially bearing in mind the fact that the tourbillon is extremely visible on the front of the watch, and the fact that it's tried to retain some of Vacheron Constantin's characteristic elements, such as that white minute track around the edge of the dial. And so, really, with this amount of functionality and these features, they've also had to exploit the case back to show the rest of the functions, such as the star chart. And this allows the watch to take on a very inspirational form from every angle, with the case back displaying the zodiac as well, giving a very interesting contrast between the very precise and very accurate measures of the front of the watch to these somewhat different styles of measures on the case back. But of course, most obvious about this watch is the engraving throughout the case. And this is done by hand into this pink gold case, and gives this incredible level of detailing with the phoenix as the inspiration for this watch, with, as you can see, feathers running across the lugs, which are beautifully bordered, which means you don't get any sort of spillover of the engraving. And in fact, even the bottom of the lugs and the tips of the lugs, in addition to rings on the case back, are decorated to give a truly complete decoration of this timepiece. And the extent of the craftsmanship on this watch is incredible, where the detailing on that case is concerned, but also in the polishing of the bridge, for example, for the tourbillon, which takes upwards of 10 hours to polish from knowledge of other versions from Vacheron Constantin. And so really the amount of time taken with this watch has to be quite incredible to be able to create such a complex and also mechanically impressive piece. And though this piece doesn't particularly float my boat because I feel it is simply too much, I can certainly understand why it would be an appealing option for the owner of this unique piece. And whilst no pricing details have been published regarding this unique piece, bearing in mind the fact that a standard, if ever anything of the sort existed from Vacheron Constantin, tourbillon costs from the brand over £100,000 in an undecorated gold case, with only the tourbillon, none of the rest of this functionality, I dread to think the price of this watch. Though there was an example of watchmaking craft and of really incredible skill, this really is a wonderful depiction. And so I'll conclude the video there But do tell me in the comments down below what you thought of the video, and indeed of the watches that I've spoken about, because there really was quite a range today, but I was keen to include this variety because I think there were quite a few interesting pieces this month. And so if you did enjoy the video, then do like, share and subscribe to help the channel, and also to be able to see more videos and content here in the future. So thank you very much for watching. This is Armand the Watch Guy, out.